Welcome to a brand new episode of IDTALK4ED Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Sarfo-Mensah, and if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that you return for future episodes and new content. And if you are a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, I welcome you back. And I hope that today's episode is one that you find enlightening, informative, and insightful. So before we get into the main conversation, if you are on YouTube, I ask that you press that red subscribe button so you can get notifications on future episodes of IDTALK4ED Live, as well as other visual content. The channel is under my name, Sarfo-Mensah, which you can see here in this visual. But if you are somebody who is listening from Apple Podcasts or the other streaming platforms, you can subscribe there as well. So yeah, we're always looking to increase our viewer and listenership so we can get this good information out there. So thank you for those who continue to listen and view this podcast as it continues to grow. Thank you so much. All right, people, let's get to the main event. So today's episode is one that I think is one of the most important conversations that we're going to have on this podcast, because when we think about the racially charged climate we're in, not just in America, but just throughout the entire world, we have to talk about these three words, a white supremacy culture. And I know that it could be triggering for a lot of the white viewers and listeners who regularly tune into this podcast, but I feel like it's a conversation that needs to be had. And we really need to do a deep dive into what exactly white supremacy culture is, how does it manifest itself within our world, within the different industries, and how does understanding this make us better educators for our students within our school communities. So today, I am bringing on someone who has done extensive research on this topic. And when we talk about white supremacy culture, she is someone who we go to for this information. And I'm just honored to have her on to talk to us more about this. So without further ado, I'd love to bring on Dr. Tema Okun to the podcast to talk to us about what white supremacy culture is and what we can do as a unit to combat it in the different contexts we're in. So let's bring on Dr. Okun to have this conversation. Hello.
Let me unmute myself. Hi. And please call me Tema. Please call me Tema.
How are you doing, Tema?
I'm okay. So I'm very happy to be here. It's an honor to be asked. Thank you.
Yes. So let's go right into the conversation, because there's a lot going on in our world, a lot going on. Mm-hmm. And there's still a lot of questions that we have to have answered. But before we get into that deep conversation, I'd like to start by giving my guests the opportunity to share a little bit about themselves, you know, their upbringing, how they grew up, and what ultimately brought them into the field of education. So what was that journey for you personally?
So I'm talking to you from North Carolina. I grew up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which is in the middle of the state. My father was a professor, and my mother actually worked in the schools, public schools.
Nice. My wife is a Tar Heel. She graduated from the business school at UNC. So
excellent. Yeah. Go Heels. Even though most of my work now is at Duke, so that's a whole other story. But for those of you who are in on the UNC Duke rivalry, it's long-standing and fierce. So I grew up in Chapel Hill. I live in Hillsborough now, which is about 20 minutes away. And I've always lived in this area. And I think there was a lot of serendipity that got me into education and teaching, and it wasn't a typical path at all, because I started my teaching in community-based settings as part of an organization called Grassroots Leadership, which was based in Charlotte, North Carolina. And Grassroots Leadership was supporting community organizing up and down the Southeast, and was full of a staff of very experienced community organizers. And then I was not an experienced community organizer, and they hired me, and I got to hang out with experienced organizers. And what happened was that communities would come to us and say, our community and our organization is being torn apart by racism or homophobia or sexism or class issues. Can you help us? And we didn't really know what to do. So we made a project out of our ignorance, and we created a program called Barriers and Bridges. And that was in the late 80s, early 90s. So many years ago, and started this trajectory for me of learning about how to understand what white supremacy and racism are, how to think about teaching about what they are, how to support people who wanted to do serious anti-racist work. And then so I did that in community for a long time. And in that period, I ran into and met an incredible man named Kenneth Jones, who became my mentor and teacher and colleague. And we formed a group called Change Work and started doing this kind of teaching all across the country with a couple of other people. And then at some point in there, I started burning out a little bit. And I told Kenneth, I said, Kenneth, what I really want to do is I want to start an organization called Tough Love Consulting. We're going to walk in and we're going to grab people by the shoulders and scream at them, get your shit together. And then we're going to leave. Because that's how effective I'm feeling. And Kenneth said, well, I think you're burning out. Maybe you should step back. So I started bringing the curriculum that we were using in community-based settings into college classrooms, undergraduate classrooms. And I enjoyed doing that a lot. So in that, also in that period, Kenneth died way too early. And those of us who were doing the work with him formed a new group called DR Works. And so I continued doing the work in community, and I was bringing it into classrooms. And I actually went back and got my doctorate so I could continue to do that. So that's kind of the trajectory.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And let's stay on Dr. Kenneth Jones for a second, because as I was doing my research and reading up on white supremacy culture, so the article that you all collaborated on for the Dismantling Racism workbook 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I didn't realize at the time that you actually took it upon yourself to give Kenneth credit for the work that you were doing, even though, you wrote the article, you were very cognizant in saying, you know what, I couldn't have done it without Kenneth Jones. And I bring this up because in this day and age, when we talk about anti-racist work, especially when we talk about white people who are engaged in it actively, whether it's a Robin DiAngelo, whether it's a Jane Elliott, whoever you name, there's, we have certain people of color who believe that there are certain people who don't always give that acknowledgement to those Black and brown people who have engaged in this work years ago.
Yeah.
And they don't get the credit. So, for you to do that, I thought was just huge, because that's not something that always happens when we talk about white people who engage in this work. So I want to give you a chance to just share with our listeners and viewers what impact that Dr. Kenneth Jones had on your career, and how did he influence your work as a scholar and an educator in it.
I'll do that. There are also a couple other people who need to be named and get credit.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So Kenneth and I met when we were, I was still at Grassroots Leadership, and he was working at a place called the Peace Development Fund in the Northeast. And they were funding some of our work in South Carolina, and we were doing the work in South Carolina. And the organizations were having turf issues, which is pretty common, We didn't think they understood what was really happening on the ground, and they didn't understand what we're doing. And so the solution they thought, the powers that be thought, was to bring Kenneth and me together and to do some training together. So that's how we met. So we met on the at the Penn Center in South Sea Islands, off the coast of South Carolina, and did an initial training there. And actually, on the website, I tell a story about that because the relationship between the two of us was really cemented there when he just showed such incredible grace and support for and to me. And that was a very unusual experience for me. And so I loved him from the very beginning. And he was about 4 years older than me. He was a lot more experienced than I was, and just a very generous, very knowledgeable person, very creative. So we formed this partnership that we were just able to be very generative and very collaborative. And he was more grounded. So I feel like most of my grounding sort of came from the work I'd been doing before with colleagues at Grassroots Leadership, so James Williams and Kathy Howell and Kamayu Marsharia and Alfreda Berenger. So I did have some grounding already, and then Kenneth kind of came, and we together he helped me go even deeper. And just the way that someone, well, maybe I shouldn't assume that this happens for a lot of people, but just I was able to find a colleague who was just, smart, funny, engaging, laid back. Yeah. And so he just, there was no way I would know anything that I know if I hadn't been in relationship with everybody I've been in relationship. But James was a key influence, and Kenneth was a very key influence as well. And then at the time of the article, I was in California for a year, and I'd gone to a People's Institute training where one of the trainers was a man named Daniel Buford, who was training for them at the time. And he gave one of the most brilliant talks on linguistic racism that I've heard then or since. And so I feel like, and then I was also going to the challenging white supremacy workshops that Sharon Martinez was leading. So both of them had a deep impact on my thinking in the way that the article came together. And so I feel like it's important to credit all three of them, and it's important to credit everybody who, I just don't believe in this idea of, in my experience, in my life experience, of sort of original work. Everything I know because I'm in a relationship with other people, and everything, so I just think it's always a collaborative experience. To share anything anything that I would share would not be something that was just mine alone. That's the way I feel about it.
And we'll definitely talk more about the article itself, but I actually want to rewind back to your childhood, because from what I researched, I know that your father was someone who was involved in academia as well, and you would describe your parents as being liberal in their political nature and how they were active in the civil rights movement, particularly around the Jim Crow era. So I want to know, how did that experience shape, or has it influenced the work that you currently do right now, looking back?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No question about it at all. My father was also Jewish, and so he also felt very strongly what it meant to be a Jew in the South. This was at a time when I think there was only one synagogue in our whole area. So, so there were both influences on me. And I don't, I wish I could ask my parents. I know where my father got his values from, because his parents were first generation immigrants and came over with very progressive values. But my mother grew up in the middle of Texas in a family that had immigrated generations before. So I don't quite know. I wish I could go back and ask her. She played a key role for me. She was the one who, overhearing a conversation I was having with someone about how I wasn't racist, she turned to me and she said, "You are. You're a white girl growing up in the South. You're racist. You must deal with it. Deal with it." And so it's because of her that I was able to go from like, I'm not, to, oh, okay, let me think about this differently. And I would love to, you know, my parents were real, they lived their values really well, particularly in the public sphere. And then there were all kinds of mixed messages behind closed doors. So, you know, just like anything, it's complicated. You know, bringing a Black person home was different than bringing a white person home in my family. So it's not like everything was clean and clear. And I was fortunate to grow up in a family where they supported what I was doing, because I feel like a lot of the people I know white people who do anti-racist work have had to be isolated from their families in some kind of way for whatever anti-racist values they take on, and that was never true for me.
And I think that's a blessing, you know, in itself, because I know that when you really start to engage in this work, it can definitely cause separation, division within, you know, your families.
Yes.
So when we talk about, you know, white people being engaged, you know, in anti-racist work and being aware of white privilege, there are a lot of folks who say, you know what, I wasn't even aware of the fact that I had a privilege until I reached adulthood, until I reached my 30s, 40s, sometimes even later in life. And sometimes it might just be naivete. Sometimes it might just be a case of not being in a space or a context where they face it or you know, navigate it. So I'm wondering, for you personally, when did you first realize that you had privilege, you know, as a white woman? And was there a process that you had to go through to fully acknowledge that privilege?
Actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to also maybe change the question, or start with the question, when did I first realize I was white?
Please.
Yeah, because I think that the progression, the identity development for those of us who are white, is the first step is sort of like, oh, I didn't realize I was part of a racial group. I just thought I was normal, right? And I think the first time I can remember the first time I asked my mother about race, I was about 3. And when, because I saw a Black man and I pointed at him and I said, that's Mommy, a chocolate man. And she became really silent and really tense. And so I got the message that I'd asked or said something wrong, but she didn't tell me what it was, and she didn't have a way to talk to me about it. And there were a bunch of things. And that was more realizing there's a difference, there's a racial difference here. I don't quite have words for it. And my mother or other adults in my life aren't willing to talk to me about it. Something's wrong. I don't quite know what it is. So that was sort of my first memories of starting to become, I don't know that I was aware of myself as white at that point. I just knew that there was something. I knew there was Black for sure, and I was still sort of figuring all that out. And I think that my awareness of myself as a white person and of white privilege followed a pretty typical trajectory for people like me in sort of larger liberal towns where desegregation didn't happen until I was in high school. And I think it was more this idea, this sort of benevolent, paternalistic idea that I'm white, I'm better off, I should help, I should be helpful, I need to help. I need to help the poor other who needs my help. So I think that was my frame of reference for a really long time, because my parents, although they were very, very good liberals and did some very bold things, that was basically their attitude too. It's sort of this idea that the goal of racial justice is to lift people into whiteness, because whiteness is where everybody wants to be. Whereas now I would say nobody really wants to be or should want to be in whiteness. I think whiteness is toxic to everyone. So there was that kind of assumption. And I think I didn't really start having language for it, even though I lived through the desegregation of my school. until I started working at grassroots leadership, and I had to be responsible for helping people think it through. And I remember one of the things that we did was we went to all the trainings that were available to people at that time, which included the People's Institute. There was something called the Equity Institute in the Bay Area. Crossroads Ministry was doing work, and my mind just kept getting blown over and over and over and over again. And then I was called upon to teach that material right away. And I can remember, I am kind of a slow learner. I can remember standing in front of groups of people and saying something, and years later, I'm going, "Oh, that's why I say that." So I think the understanding of white privilege and the way that whiteness works started then. I certainly didn't get that information in school or from my teachers or at church or anywhere else.
Right. And I think that's a story that a lot of other white people share as well. That trajectory of how they arrived at, where they are. So white supremacy culture, it's a term that we hear a lot in a lot of people's lexicon. And I've adopted it, over the past, year or so, just from, reading your work and just really engaging with how I've interacted with it in my own life and how I've seen others interact with it from their perspective. But I'm interested in knowing, and for those who are watching as well, who need clarity around what it is, why is this term so emotionally triggering for white folks? Because I know for me, being a person of color and even going through all the characteristics, it's like, yep, I agree with everything. But for a white person, it's like, ooh, like a taboo word, but we're just trying to speak truth. So
yeah,
what's so emotionally triggering about this term, white supremacy culture?
Well, I think unless you're in the group, in the white group, as somebody who's overtly supporting the idea, I think the reason it's disturbing is because it's the power of language and particularly the power of words or labels to communicate something that I believe strikes fear in people. So when we talk about white supremacy culture and white supremacy, what the culture teaches us that is it's the Klan, or it's the neo-Nazis, or it's the Proud Boys or the white nationalists. That's white supremacy, which it is. It totally is white supremacy. And in the meantime, we're not taught to understand that race was created as a hierarchy with white at the top and black at the bottom. So this is how race was constructed, that race isn't real. It was constructed as a hierarchy with other groups of color moving up and down between white and black based on what capitalism and profit and economic and socially political situation needs. That indigenous people have been the attempt to erase indigenous people has been so persistent that they don't appear on the hierarchy at all, although they obviously exist and thrive and struggle and fight as they're doing now, with great deliberation in Michigan. So I think that that white supremacy, this idea of white supremacy, strikes fear in us because we sense that it's not a good thing, and that if we start to look more closely at it, we're going to find out that essentially there's something wrong with us, that essentially we're bad. And the problem isn't white people, the problem is white supremacy, but it's so easy to get those two things conflated. And the problem is that those of us in the white group don't understand and have not been taught how we are constantly invited into this thing called whiteness that actually does not serve us or anyone very well at all. And that in this constant invitation, part of the invitation is to believe and take in and internalize that we're not just normal, we're also better, which tells you how clever white supremacy culture is. So we're both normal and better, which is hard to do. It's hard to be normal and better. But that's what we are as white people. And so and how those internalizations then start to play out in our day-to-day lives, in our relationships with each other. And what I like to say in terms of trying to understand how white supremacy culture operates is what we know from experience with it is that its purpose is to disconnect in service of power and profit. That's its purpose. So to disconnect white people from people of color across lines of race, to disconnect people within their own groups, to disconnect us from ourselves, to disconnect us from God or science or whatever it is that you believe about the universe, to disconnect us from the earth. I mean, just look at the way we, treat the earth and the wind and the stars and the sun and the water. So it's a disconnect project. And, I know that we're talking to educators. So thinking about thinking about the way that white supremacy culture permeates the institution of education and permeates schooling and sets up white children as being the norm and better, and sets up Black and brown children as being automatically deficit. And, and that the assumption in schools, the unspoken assumption in schools is we're going to raise everybody into whiteness, because to be a success at school, you need to come every day, do your homework, get good grades, and then get a job, and then go shopping. That's sort of the unquestioned culture around how schools operate. It's very much it's very much a reproduction of white supremacy, because we're not taught to see it. So a white teacher, it doesn't even have to be a white teacher, a teacher in a classroom will not understand the way that racism and white supremacy works. And a white child will go, oh, I know. And that teacher will write a note to the child's parents, or even call them up and say, your child is so curious and so engaged in their learning. And a Black child will go, I know. And the teacher will go, okay, that child is too aggressive. That child is scary. I'm going to send that child to the principal's office. They're going to start to get a record. And all of a sudden we've entered a child into the school to prison pipeline. And because the individual teacher sends them to the principal's office, the principal also doesn't see how white supremacy and institutional racism operate, don't have the means or the capacity to start to discern the ways that they need to be able to discern, set them into that system and reinforce a culture that says white children are genius and Black children are dangerous. So that's how it works. And that's not, while on the surface that's better for the white child, I'm going to argue it's not good for any of us. It's not good for the teacher. It's not good for any of the children. This is not a culture that is good for us. So.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more, because when we think about white supremacy culture, it's so encompassing of other things, because you can't talk about white supremacy culture without talking about the white dominant culture.
Right.
The fact that you have to be cisgender, the fact that you have to be Christian, white, right, able-bodied, and all these other identifiers that align with the dominant culture. And then even just speaking on a lot of legislation that's taking place right now. I mean, people are talking about critical race theory, but I would argue that the battle's not really against critical race theory itself. It's really about, Republicans, conservatives, and other political pundits trying to maintain this white supremacist structure that is in place within our society. Is really about the maintenance of that and that power. But we're using the term critical race theory as a pawn, like in that scheme.
Yes,
it's distracting people.
It's straight out of their playbook. I mean, this is what they do. They find a term, they find a theory, they find a label that they then attach to fear. Then they then say, here's something that we need to be afraid of, and then they use it as a way. I mean, what you said, their purpose is control and power of school systems and curriculum and then the larger political landscape. I mean, the right is very clear about their mission is to capture government at every level. Unfortunately, we're not as clear about that on our side, I'm afraid. But
yes, it's still a process. It's very much still a process. So when you wrote about white supremacy culture 20 years ago, you had, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think there were maybe 14 different characteristics at that time.
Don't remember.
It was like I know it was like maybe 14 or 15, but
yeah,
it was, that many characteristics. And I know that, recently, 20 years later, you've made some recent revisions to the framework. So I'm interested in knowing what caused you to make the revisions in the framework.
Sure. And I want to go back a minute to talk about the origins of the article again, just to say that, so Kenneth and I had been working together for about 6 or 7 years by then. And I went to this workshop with Daniel Buford and Sharon Martinez. And then I came home and I literally, it was after a meeting that was very frustrating. And I didn't think about it. I sat down and that article, the characteristics just came out. It just like flowed out. It was like I was just a vehicle as I was typing. And it was Sharon later who said, you need to offer antidotes. You can't just list out what's wrong and not talk about the antidotes. So so the article, and then Daniel read it and looked and said, here are some things that I think I contributed that I want to get credit for. And of course I wanted to credit him for that. And so that's where the original came from. And that original was also, I would say, what I wanted to communicate about it was that these are characteristics of the ways that we are with each other. They're not unique to white people. They're not unique to people of color. What they do is they show up in communities and in organizational settings as standards or as ways of being that go unquestioned and are seen as, either they're not seen at all, or if they are seen, they're just seen as the way that we're supposed to be with each other. So perfectionism, or there's one right way to do something. Those two go together really well. Or defensiveness about being about the truth being told. So all of them, it's just about the ways that we can form small cultures, like in small groups, or larger cultures and whole institutions that don't serve people. And in fact, I would say they're doing what they're meant to do, which is to propel a specific agenda or way of being forward without giving us the room to breathe and sort of bring our full selves to any kind of process, and to respect the power differences in any kind of group. So 20 years later, I felt like what I was seeing a couple of things. I was seeing people weaponize the list. So to use the list against each other and to say, you're doing these things and that makes you a bad person. And I wanted to speak to that, because the list was not created for that purpose. The list was created to help us all catch our own behavior and figure out how we can do things differently. And I wanted to speak to the tendency to want to weaponize a list because we want, and I wanted to speak to the nuances in each of the characteristics a little bit more, because it's not either or. It's not right or wrong. And I don't think any of the characteristics are useful. I'm not a proponent of any of the characteristics, and I think that the way they show up has a lot to do with context and who's got power and how we're going to be in that moment. So I wanted to be able to speak to that a little bit more, flesh it out with some stories, and just bring more life and nuance to it than had been there before. And I wanted to include the story of, putting Kenneth's name on it to explain why his name isn't in the same place as it was, because he was really angry with me for putting his name on it. He said, I didn't write this. And I said, but you influence everything I write. He said, I don't care, take my name off of it. So I did, but luckily for me, it kept circulating with his name on it. I couldn't do anything about it. So.
There you go. But I think it's important to note, as you mentioned, that with white supremacy culture, this isn't just for white folks. I mean, people of color, Black, brown people, indigenous people, Latinx people, whatever you are, we also perpetuate white supremacy culture, because in the end, we come into a world where we're indoctrinated by whiteness.
Yeah.
And as a result, our internalized racism that we accumulate over time allows for this perpetuation of white supremacy culture to happen. And I could just speak on that from experience.
Well, it's also becomes a survival mechanism too. I mean, that's why I don't want it to be used as a weapon. I don't like it to be weaponized. It's like sometimes, if you're going to keep your job, if you're going to, that's the kind of stuff that we need to understand, that people are juggling a lot of different things, that we want to be free. And while we're working to be free, people have to feed their families and house themselves and get health care. And so I think that's the kind of nuance I wanted to bring into it.
Yes. And, you mentioned the fact that you notice that there are folks who are weaponizing the list to shame other people. So I have a question for you about this trend of cancel culture that we're experiencing, not just on social media, but just throughout our society. And, as a person of color, I know that it's hard to always have a restorative approach when it comes to this work, because, we carry all this racial bad fatigue and all this racialized trauma just from our own experiences. And there are just some days where it's like, you know what? I don't feel like telling y'all about what it's like to be a Black person.
Right.
Like, I don't feel like giving you all this education, but I also understand that if I don't do it, who will? So you always feel like there's an obligation on your part to have to impart that knowledge to others, particularly white people within, your professional setting or whatever context. So what I'm wondering from you is, when is it appropriate to call somebody in versus calling somebody out?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, context is everything.
Yeah.
If I could give you an easy answer, I definitely would do that. And I think that a lot has to do with what's the relationship. What's your stake in the relationship? What is your, and sometimes the stake can just be personal care and love for somebody. Sometimes your stake is, I need to keep my job. It's sort of like what's going on here that I need to pay attention to. And where am I? What am I actually capable of in this moment? So one of the reasons I'm such a believer in community organizing, I make the joke that I'm not an organizer, but some of my best friends are organizers. It's because I think that the power of community is so critical to our ability to do meaningful racial justice, racial equity work. And one of the examples or reasons for that is that if you're tired, and as part of a community, you can say, I'm tired, I can't do this today. And I can say, okay, I'll do that, because I actually have energy today. Or when I'm tired, you can say, I've got it today. That we can hold each other in our different, because some days I haven't got patience for anyone, including myself. And some days I'm just completely open-hearted and ready for whatever is coming at me. So I think being able to be honest with myself about that, being able to ask for help, because I am part of a community of people who are thinking about this together, that I can say I'm willing to take something on. And I think it's also good to know, if it's possible for you to know, any group of you to know what else is going on in your community. So if some white person comes up to you and starts to ask a lot of questions and you don't have energy for it, maybe there's a surge chapter in your community. You can go, these are all great questions. You know what, I'm going to refer you to the surge chapter, which is showing up for racial justice. If you know what some of the other things are that are going on around you, you can say, that's a great question. I don't have the energy to answer it, but here's somebody who probably does. So that's why I think it's so important for us to be in movement and in community with each other, and to be able to, none of us needs to feel like it's our singular responsibility to put on the cape and save the day. I've never seen that work. So just to think of this as a collective challenge, a collective piece of work, a collective joy, seems to me really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, with this podcast, we talk a lot about what things happen at the K-12 level, but I want to transition into the higher ed space because that's where I know you currently are, at Duke University. And one thing that we've seen over the past couple of years is, universities and institutions of higher learning putting out these statements showing solidarity when it comes to anti-racism and really engaging in the work.
Yeah.
But sometimes their actions that follow come off as being very much performative.
Yeah.
So I know at Duke University, you co-lead the Teaching for Equity Fellows program, where you provide support to faculty members and professors who are really trying to dig in and engage in this work in a very non-performative way.
Yeah.
So I'd love for you to talk more about the program and how are those faculty members, really engaging in the work? Because I know that's a process for them, especially if they are teaching students of color, within their different courses.
Yeah. So I want to say something about how you introduce this, which is I do think it can feel really discouraging, whether you're doing work on the K through 12 level or at higher ed, wherever you're doing work, it can feel really discouraging to come up against the institutional barriers that inevitably exist as people try to do racial equity work. And that's definitely been my experience at Duke. And, it raises the question, people who do the kind of work that I do, which is, I don't work for Duke directly. I'm a consultant. I'm called in with my colleague, Krista, and my colleague, Kristen, Emily, and Barbara. We have this program that we designed for faculty. And so Duke hires us to deliver it. And I could speak for hours about that and the challenges of that and the sort of moral question about what does it mean for us to be doing this work at an institution like Duke, where we have so little power to actually make change happen. And I use this word both thoughtfully and advisedly, which is that sometimes feeling like we're pimping out racial equity, we're pimping out racial justice, we're pimping out our work.
Right.
We're giving Duke a way to say, look at what we're doing, when what we are also seeing is that there's very little structural shift happening. What I will say about the program, and the reason I continue to do it, is that it's not mandatory, it's voluntary, and so it attracts faculty at Duke who really care about their students and who really care about their teaching. And Duke is a Research 1 institution, or Research 1+ institution. They care very much about research. They don't care a lot about teaching. And so one of the things that's powerful about this program is it brings together people who really care about teaching and gives them a place to really talk with each other. And so I feel like there is this way in which the curriculum that we deliver is based on providing a shared framework and then giving us lots of opportunities to dig deep into issues like the student experience, curriculum, working with peers and organizing peers, and assessment and evaluation, and how do you do these things equitably in classrooms, and includes things like, what does it mean to have an equitable classroom when your content isn't specifically about race, like in a biology classroom or math classroom, which is, I think, where some of our most significant work is happening. So I think so I'm of two minds. I'm aware that institutions aren't actually shifting, and I have seen that firsthand because of the limits of what our program is able to do, even when we ask and push. And also that there are these communities where people are really shifting. So it's a kind of a both and. I've seen some real changes in the way people approach their teaching and the way relationships they're having with their students now, the way they think about their curriculum. So I think that's the both and that that we're all in the tension of, the other huge both and, I think, is that racial justice was needed over 400 years ago, not to mention 5 seconds ago, right? So it's beyond time that we are taking the significant steps to create equity and justice. And at the same time, the white people that I know, many of us are doing the very best we can, and it's not enough. So that's another huge tension, which is like, BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous people of color, communities of color need and deserve justice now, not tomorrow. And white people we're so far behind. We're still trying to understand how racism and white supremacy work. And many of us are doing the very best we can, and it's not enough. So that's another huge tension that I see happening.
And this may be outside the scope of the work that you're currently doing at Duke, but I'm just curious because over the past few months, we've seen a lot of Black scholars, Black professors who are on the tenure track not be able to get, permanency in their, with their tenure at their respective universities, whether we're talking about Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was just next door to where you are and is now at Howard, whether you're talking about Dr. Cornel West up at Harvard, and there are many other examples that I can share. What I'm wondering is, through the Teaching for Equity Fellows Program, are there parts of that program that address the inequities when it comes to whether BIPOC professors are being considered for tenure, the assessment process and the other things that go along with that?
That's a great question. I think what tends to come up more is the different ways that faculty get treated by students, because we're so focused on the classroom experience. So I think the other thing that comes up a lot is how challenging it is to actually have a racial justice curriculum or school when you have so many barriers to hiring Black and brown faculty. So I think it comes up in that way. Every department I know has a DEI committee, so diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. And I love the word equity, and I hate the word. I like the word diversity fine as a word. I don't like the word inclusion at all, because it begs the question: who are you including into what, and who gets to decide what you're including people into? And I don't actually think we're including people in things that most of us should want to be included in. It's not I want a piece of the pie. I want a whole different pie, which is what Nona LaDuke says. I'm not taking credit for that. So we need to really rethink, like in school, what would it be? I think the thing that I want to say before I forget is that one of the assumptions, this is K-12, this is at the university level, is that white students are fine and the students who need help are Black, Indigenous, and students of color. And I think that that's such a terrible assumption. I think the white students need as much or more help than students of color need to understand what it means to be white in a racist context, what it means to be white in a white supremacy context, how being white affects the way they are and in the world, that it's not, that white people are not okay. White kids are not okay. And what would it mean for schools to be teaching and encouraging people to think about our mutual interdependence and about caring, as opposed to this culture in schools of this idea of original work. You have to have your original work. There can't be the rules around. We just get caught up in concerns about plagiarism versus syncretism, or just the ways that our ideas can help each other. It's an individual achievement, which is not how things happen in the outside world. So I don't know why we're doing that in school. So I just want to say that I think it's really important for us to be thinking about what is it that we're doing in classrooms where are we putting our focus? And then when we're talking about institutional inequity, why do we have so few? Why do we have so few faculty of color? And how are we defining things like qualified, and what's really going on here? So in these diversity, equity, and inclusion committees, the emphasis is so much on inclusion. Let's get more Black and brown faces around the table, and not looking at what's people's experience once they get here, how are they actually being treated, what are the policies that are in play, what's the culture, is the culture actually welcoming? So a lot of what we get in the classrooms is, when people are willing, sharing of stories about just pretty awful treatment. And so it does get addressed. It doesn't get addressed as directly as I think you're thinking, because mostly what we're doing is talking about the classroom experience.
Right. And then a couple things, because I think, for one, I appreciate your take on the word inclusion, because I never considered it from that perspective. The term diversity, that bothers me personally, because when I think about diversity, it just kind of goes back to this idea of tokenism. Okay, we'll be diverse. Let's just get a couple of Black faces, a couple of Indigenous faces, Latinx faces, so we can create the illusion that we are an inclusive community, where we are. But then it just begs to ask the question, well, what are we doing to try to decolonize our policies? What are we doing to decolonize our curriculum? What are we doing to decolonize some of the ways in which we interact with our students within the courses? And I couldn't help but think about my own teacher training, like how I was trained to become a teacher in a K-12 system, that same K-12 system where I learned where I inherited all these ideals of whiteness.
Yeah.
I'm now being trained to do the very same thing as an educator. So hearing your program and how it works, I feel like it's going to have a major impact, and hopefully, get teacher educators to have a paradigm shift when it comes to how they prepare in pre-service teachers for the classroom experience.
Yeah. Well, a sad story about this, I'm afraid, is that I got my doctorate at UNC Greensboro. It was I had a wonderful experience there. That's a really strong education department. And at the time, I was teaching, I was teaching a class for undergraduates about race, class, and gender. And it was a required class in the education department for people who wanted to be education majors. But by the time, and there were 9 sections. So there were 9 of us who were doctoral students who were teaching it. And it was great because we would consult with each other and help each other. And by the time I left, the course was no longer required because they were substituting a course about testing. So, I think that your story, and I think we're sending teachers out into schools with not prepared, not at all prepared for what they're going to do.
Absolutely. And I think it goes back to this whole idea of theory versus practice, because, going through my own training, it was very standard. I learned about Jean Piaget. I learned about Lev Vygotsky, zonal proximal development. I learned about Edward Skinner, the behaviorist theory. I still know these things to this day. And these are all brilliant people. But in the end, I only remember these things because I knew that I needed to keep those in my mind to pass my praxis test. Or whatever teacher licensure test I was going to have to take in order to get my certification. It wasn't a case where, okay, I'm going to apply Piaget, when I get into the classroom, or Vygotsky. That wasn't the case for me. I knew that it was strictly to pass the test. And so when I think about, the different programs, whether we're talking about ETS, the Educational Testing Service, when I think about Pearson, when I think about Kaplan and all these other companies that pretty much capitalize off of really white supremacy, if you think about it, it's just mind blowing to me.
Yeah, well, you can trace school testing back through IQ testing, back through racist immigration testing. Yeah, so when I think about K through 12 educators, and there are three resources that I highly recommend. One is older. It's called Dreamkeepers. It's Gloria Ladson-Billings' Dreamkeepers, Successful Teachers of African American Children, because it's just a classic, great book. And it does have real live tips that you can use for how to teach. And it should just be called Successful Teachers, period. I think it's about successful teachers. The other one is a really wonderful book called Black Ants and Buddhists by Mary Cowley, who taught a racial justice curriculum or a justice curriculum to her kindergarten and first grade class. And she details how she does that. And I actually would take some of her curriculums and adapt them for undergraduate college classes. It's a compelling book. And then I tell people to subscribe to Rethinking Schools, because there's so many resources there for how to do justice curriculum. And there's, I think one of the beautiful things about today is there's so much out there for teachers now, which is really great to support an anti-racist teaching practice.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many resources. I mean, it's in abundance at this point.
Yeah.
Whether you talk about Rethinking Schools, whether you're talking about the Zen Education Project, Learning for Justice, there's so many right now. There's no excuse in terms of, not being able to find these resources, at this point.
Algebra Project and Bob Moses, who just died.
Yes. As a middle school math teacher, Bob Moses is somebody who, I looked up to and just aspired to just do half of what he was able to do. All right, I have one more question before we get to lightning round. And it's a question that, I pose to, folks who are really engaged in this work, because, we've seen a lot of different instances of performative allyship. And it's getting to the point where it's just becoming very pervasive. So I'm interested in knowing from you, how can white educators make that shift from performative allyship to becoming active co-conspirators when we talk about anti-racist work?
Right.
What should that look like?
This may not be a satisfactory answer, because it's more about how we need to be rather than what we should do.
Yes.
And so the thing when people ask me to give talks these days, what I tell them I want to talk about is the stake that white people have in racial justice, and inviting any white people in the audience to think about what's our direct stake in racial justice. So to take it out of this realm of our role as white people is to help people of color, or to live into some kind of moral imperative about that, and rather to understand that my freedom, Tema's freedom, my ability, my happiness actually is deeply tied in with my ability to live in a racially just world. And to the extent that racial injustice continues to happen, to the extent that I am still operating out of my racist conditioning, then and I can tell you that blocks my ability to be happy, which blocks my ability to be free. And to me, the goal here for all of us is to be free, to thrive, and to love each other, to be connected to each other, to live good lives with each other. And so I think that performance, I'm not as critical of performance as some people, because performance is something. You're doing something, and it could be a lead-in to going more deeply. And I think that to me, the magic of racial equity work is that anything I do to lean into my own practice as an anti-racist white person it helps me in every area of my life, in every area of my life. So if I catch my racist conditioning in my role as a teacher, then that catch is going to help me in my relationship with you, in my relationship with my white friends. It's the things aren't separate. It's like understanding the way that white supremacy culture has gotten in my bones and trying to bring awareness to it so I can act differently with all of my beloveds, means I'm going to be more effective. I'm going to be happier. I'm going to be more free. So that's, to me, just my suggestion to all of us who are white on this call is just get really, really clear that that we're doing this work because our lives depend on it. Ruby Sales, who's a African-American public theologian, really, really good. Her videos are on the website, the 2 websites that I manage. She says that she doesn't see whiteness as a privilege, she sees it as a death sentence. And I come to believe that. I mean, I think that this invitation into whiteness is toxic. I don't think white supremacy culture is good for anyone. I don't think belonging to whiteness is good for anyone. There's this semblance that it's good. Like if you belong to the white group, you're going to get certainly generally more material benefits, although that's not true for everyone. And you're going to get some so-called psychic benefits. But in the end, what you're doing is you're being invited into this cultural repeating system that encourages you to cut off your humanity so you can do things that can't be justified. And that's why we have such high rates of alcoholism and suicide and homicide and depression. And, we're in deep trouble, not just politically, but psychically as a culture. And so, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, with performative actions, I definitely agree. It's a step in the right direction. I think for me, when the performance ends up being the ceiling of your engagement, that's where it becomes problematic. But I definitely agree. It's a step in the right direction. So I think it all goes back to what you said about context.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sort of like sometimes I do have to fake it until I can make
it. Yes. But Tema, we could talk about this for like another hour, but I know we don't have that kind of time. So before we wrap things up, I do want to give people an opportunity to get to know you outside of work, because I do believe that joy is a form of resistance, and we have to humanize ourselves and sometimes let people know that we're humans too. We do things outside as work in order to be sane and to stay focused and have the energy to still stay the course when it comes to this work. So we're going to go into our lightning round to learn more about you. So
question, does anybody ever do a lightning round for you?
No, but we could remix it. You could, hey, I'm open to it.
You need to answer every question too.
I sure will.
Okay.
All right. So first question, favorite self-care activity that you do right now?
So I'm looking through the windows in my office to a big chair. I have a chair that's the size of half of a sofa. My favorite self-care activity is to sit in that chair. Awesome. Just sit in that chair. Do nothing. What's yours?
Right. Mine right now is to, I'm exercising right now. So my wife and I were currently doing this diet and exercise program where we can't eat carbs, can't eat any sugar. We're exercising 6 days a week. We're drinking a gallon of water every single day. And, I've been able to lose, 15 pounds. And I know my wife at this point has lost 20. So, we've made a lot of progress over the past couple of months. So right now, self-care for us is exercising.
Nice. Very nice.
Yes. A book that you're currently reading.
So I'm reading Finding Refuge by Michelle Johnson. She's a friend and a former colleague, or we still work together sometimes. She's done anti-racism work and does anti-racism work for many years, and New Kenneth as well. And she's also a yoga teacher. And this is a book about how to collectively think about grief and how to move through grief.
All right.
That's really good.
For me, the book that I'm currently reading is Robin DiAngelo's Nice Racism, which pretty much speaks to a lot of what we've talked about today, about how progressive white people, as well-meaning as they are, can perpetuate racial harm.
Yeah.
And it's been a pretty good read. So for those who have read White Fragility, it's pretty much a continuation of that, but building on just a lot of the ideas that she shares in the first book. So it's a good read, and I recommend it to anybody, not just white people, but anybody who just wants to, get some more clarity and context around, how whiteness works and white supremacy culture. It's a really good book.
Yeah, she just sent me a draft of a book that she's going to put out with Amy Bertain about facilitating white affinity spaces. So that'll be good.
Yeah, she actually has a few chapters in White Racism where she actually talks about her experiences facilitating in those affinity spaces, some of the ups and downs and the challenges that come with that.
Yeah.
So she's, very transparent, as always, about, her own journey.
Yeah.
So I know you're very much into yoga. That's something that you're really into. So I'm interested in knowing, is there one yoga move that you've really found to be really challenging before you start to, get the hang of it and the stability?
My answer is that I can't really do the balancing ones very well at all. I can't do anything that requires me balancing on my wrists. So I can't even really do the downward dog properly because I can't put my weight on my wrists. But the balancing ones are always very challenging. And when they come up, like the what's the name of the one where you put your leg up?
Yeah. I get the name.
I get really nervous because I know it's going to be hard for me to do. But I actually really like it because it's a good practice and like trying to calm myself and breathe and not be worried about my performance of it. So yeah. What about you?
I've done yoga, a couple of times, and I'm with you. Any moves that require me to have balance, I realize now that you have to have, really strong core in order to maintain your balance with some of those moves. But I can't pinpoint, a specific move that really gave me problems. What I will say is, any move that requires me to show, any kind of balance, I tend to struggle.
Yeah. Metaphor for something. Yeah.
Right. If you could invite 3 figures, influential figures, to dinner, dead or alive, who would they be for you?
So I thought about this for a while. I would invite James Baldwin, I would invite Harriet Tubman, and I would invite Gloria Steinem.
Oh, you named those out quick. You came ready for that question.
I'm ready for that question. Yes.
Okay.
I mean, who wouldn't know those 3 people?
Yeah. That's a good group. And James Baldwin is a popular choice in this podcast for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
For me, I would invite Kobe Bryant, not because he was my all-time favorite basketball player, but because he was somebody who just personified greatness. So I would love to have a conversation with him about how he was able to persevere, through his early years, coming out of high school, and how he was able to transfer that greatness into the business realm, him winning, awards for storytelling and writing books. So I would have loved to have a conversation with Kobe. As far as my other 2, I would love to, I know it's a cliche choice, but I would love to have a sit down with Barack Obama.
Oh, of course, that would be great.
I mean, who wouldn't want to, sit with Barack? And then the third one, I want to put a woman in there. I would say third one. Oof, so many to choose from.
I know.
I'm going to go with. You know what? I think I'm gonna go with maybe Toni Morrison.
Ooh, that would be good.
I'm gonna say Toni Morrison.
Yeah.
Because I know, she always was cognizant about not writing in the white gaze. And when you look at, a lot of anti-racist books, particularly books that are written by white anti-racist educators, it's written that for obvious reasons. And I understand the function of it, but I know sometimes it can, for lack of a better word, not minimize, but it can kind of decrease the magnitude of some of the issues that are happening when it comes to, racism and all the other isms that we experience in our society. And I always love the fact that she was unapologetic about not writing within that lens.
Yeah.
So
that documentary called A Life in Fragments or A Life in Pieces. So powerful. I just love that documentary. Yeah. That's a good choice. She would be good to talk to. Yeah.
Yes. Ooh. All right. Last question. Who would you like to see as a future guest on this podcast?
I think it would be great to have, and I don't have a specific person in mind, but to have a teacher who's really trying to, or successfully doing social justice work in their classroom. You may have already done that. But I'm thinking it'd be so good to have some teacher-to-teacher conversation. I don't know if Mary Cowey is still teaching, but the author of Black Ants and Buddhists, but I think it would be great to hear from a teacher about what they're doing and how they're facing it.
Yeah, we've had a lot of teachers who engage in that work come on this podcast, and that's always, I'm always open to having more, because this is a show for them.
Yeah.
For me, there are a lot of people who I love to have on the podcast. But if I could choose one person that I'd love to have on here, so many. I'm gonna go ahead and say Chris Emdin. I'm gonna say Chris Emdin, and he's somebody whose work I admire and I follow, and as someone who grew up in hip hop culture and understand what that is and how it permeates within our education system. Chris Emdin is someone who very much personifies that and pretty much speaks and embodies the language that I try to convey as an educator. So it'll be great to have a conversation with him on this platform. And, I've reached out to him personally, so I know that day's going to come. I'm manifesting it.
Great.
Yes. Tema, thank you so much. I know it's been a long week, so I'm extremely and eternally grateful for you just taking the time to chat with me for a little bit.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, and I hope you have a much better week coming up.
Okay. Me too.
Yes. All right.
All right.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right, people. We're about to end another episode of IDTALK4ED Educators Live. And as always, I wish you all a good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.